In the summer of 1842, a black man standing in a tobacco field in Virginia did something that would be talked about in whispers for generations. He looked a white overseer directly in the eyes and said, "You're wrong, and I can prove it," then proceeded to save an entire harvest that everyone else had given up for lost, transforming himself from property into legend in a single growing season. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of resilience, intelligence, and the unbreakable human spirit, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you forgotten stories of courage and resistance every week, stories about real people who changed history through their brilliance and determination. These are the lives that textbooks often overlook, the black heroes whose legacies deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Now, let me take you back to Virginia in 1825, to a small farm where a legend was born. The Morrison Farm sprawled across 800 acres of Virginia's Piedmont region, rolling hills covered in tobacco plants that stretched toward distant mountains. It wasn't one of the grand plantations that dominated the Tidewater. Robert Morrison owned 23 enslaved people, a modest operation by the standards of Virginia's slaveholding class. The main house was a two-story wooden structure, painted white but showing signs of age, surrounded by outbuildings, a barn, smokehouse, tool shed, and 6 cabins where the enslaved families lived. James Brooks was born in the second cabin on a cold March night in 1825. His mother, Hannah, was a strong black woman who worked in the main house as a cook, her dark hands creating meals that fed white mouths while her own family survived on rations. His father, Samuel, was a black field worker whose powerful body had been breaking soil for the Morrison family since he was 12 years old. They named their son James, a common name that white people wouldn't find threatening, but Hannah whispered another name to him in private moments, a name from her grandmother's African language that meant the one who sees clearly. From his earliest memories, James possessed something unusual, not supernatural, nothing mystical, but a quality of observation and analysis that set him apart from other children. While other black children played between the cabins, James watched everything with intense focus. He noticed patterns in how plants grew, which ones thrived in which soil, how weather affected crops. He observed the white overseer, a man named William Patterson, and understood that Patterson's harsh methods actually reduced productivity rather than increasing it. He listened when adults talked in the evenings, absorbing knowledge about farming, about survival, about the careful strategies black people used to maintain dignity in a system designed to destroy it. But what truly distinguished James was his memory. This young black boy could remember everything he witnessed with extraordinary clarity. He'd see his father plant a field once and remember exactly how deep the seeds went, what spacing was used, which areas yielded best. He'd hear a conversation and recall it word for word months later. This gift of perfect recall, combined with natural intelligence and intense curiosity, meant James was learning constantly, gathering information, building understanding of the world around him. His mother recognized this quality early. "You're special, James," Hannah told her son when he was 6 years old. They sat outside their cabin at dusk, this black woman and her black child watching the sun paint the sky red and gold. "You see things other people miss. You understand things others don't. That's a gift, but it's also dangerous." "Why dangerous, Mama?" James asked, this black child's voice carrying innocent curiosity. "Because white folks don't like black people who are too smart," Hannah explained carefully. "They want us to work, not think. They want us to follow orders, not understand why those orders make sense or don't make sense. If they realize how intelligent you are, they might see you as a threat. So you have to be careful. You have to hide what you know until the right moment to use it." James absorbed this lesson, understanding even at 6 that his intelligence was both gift and burden. He learned to mask his brilliance behind a facade of simple obedience. When white people were watching, he played the role they expected, the unthinking black laborer who followed orders without question. But inside, this black child was constantly observing, analyzing, learning, preparing for moments when his knowledge might matter. The Morrison farm operated on principles that Robert Morrison had inherited from his father, methods passed down through generations without much thought or innovation. They grew tobacco as the primary cash crop, with corn and wheat for sustenance. The work followed seasonal rhythms, planting in spring, cultivating through summer, harvesting in fall, preparing for winter. The enslaved black workers did all the labor, while Morrison and his overseer Patterson supervised, enforcing productivity through threat and occasional violence. Patterson was a cruel white man who believed black people required brutality to work efficiently. He carried a whip and used it regularly, believing fear motivated better than any other tool. He'd worked as overseer on the Morrison farm for 8 years, and in his mind, the operation ran smoothly because he maintained iron control over the black workers. He never considered that the farm's modest yields might improve with different methods. He never questioned whether his harsh approach might actually be counterproductive. James began working in the fields when he was 7 years old, this black child joining his father Samuel in the tobacco rows.
The work was hard, the days long, but James approached it differently than most. While his small black hands pulled weeds and removed tobacco worms, his mind was working on larger problems. He noticed which plants grew strongest, which areas of the field produced best yields, how different weather patterns affected growth. He observed the white overseer's decisions and analyzed their outcomes, seeing patterns Patterson himself never recognized. "Papa," James said one evening after work, "why do we plant tobacco in the same fields every year? The plants in the south field are always smaller than the plants in the north field." Samuel looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. "That's the way it's always been done, James. Master Morrison's father planted that way. His grandfather planted that way. White folks don't like changes to tradition." "But the soil is different," James persisted, this black child's mind working through problems. "The south field needs something the north field has. If we could figure out what that is, we could make all the fields produce like the north field." "You're right," Samuel admitted. "The soil is tired in the south field. Been growing tobacco for 50 years without rest. But you can't suggest changes to white folks, James. They don't want to hear black people telling them how to farm their land. You have to keep these observations to yourself." James nodded, learning another lesson about the careful balance black people had to maintain. He could see solutions to problems, could understand how to improve yields, but speaking those truths to white power carried dangerous consequences. So this black child continued observing, learning, storing knowledge away for moments when it might be safely applied. The years passed, and James grew from child into young man. By age 15, this black teenager stood 6 feet tall, his body powerful from years of field labor, his dark skin marked by sun and work. But what truly distinguished James wasn't physical strength. It was the depth of knowledge he'd accumulated about farming. This young black man understood crop rotation, soil nutrition, pest management, weather prediction, techniques that most white farmers of the era didn't comprehend. He'd learned through observation, through conversation with older black workers who shared knowledge passed down through generations, through careful experimentation in the small garden plot his mother was permitted to maintain. Moses, an older black man who'd been enslaved on the Morrison farm for 30 years, recognized James's exceptional abilities. Moses was 62, his dark body bent from decades of brutal labor, but his mind remained sharp. He'd seen many young black people come through the Morrison farm, but none like James. "You remind me of someone I knew long time ago," Moses told James one Sunday afternoon. They sat in shade near the cabins, this older black man and this younger black man sharing rare rest time. Man named Caesar, who was a blacksmith in Richmond before he got sold south.
Caesar could look at a piece of broken metal and understand exactly how to fix it, understand things about iron and fire that white blacksmiths didn't know. He was an artist, but he was enslaved, so his genius went mostly unrecognized. "What happened to him?" James asked. "He got caught teaching other black folks his skills," Moses said quietly. "White folks didn't like black people gathering to learn things, even something as simple as metalwork. Caesar got sold away, transported to Louisiana. I never heard what became of him after that." James absorbed this story, understanding the warning within it. Black excellence was dangerous because it challenged white supremacy's fundamental premise. A black person who demonstrated genius threatened the lies that justified slavery. So black people like Caesar, like James himself, had to carefully navigate when to reveal their capabilities and when to hide them. But circumstances were building toward a moment when James could no longer hide his knowledge, when the choice between silence and speaking would become unavoidable. That moment arrived in the summer of 1842, when James was 17 years old, in a season that would transform him from enslaved property into legend. The spring of 1842 brought unusual weather to Virginia. Late frosts killed early plantings, then excessive rain flooded fields, then sudden drought cracked the soil. The tobacco crop, so crucial to the Morrison farm's economy, struggled from the beginning. By June, it was clear the plants were failing. The leaves yellowed prematurely, growth was stunted, and what Patterson called the rot began spreading through the fields. Robert Morrison walked his fields with increasing anxiety. He was a white man in his 50s, his family's wealth built on generations of enslaving black people, now watching that wealth threatened by crop failure. He consulted with neighboring white farmers, who offered various theories about the problem, but no real solutions. Patterson, the white overseer, blamed the black workers, claiming they weren't working hard enough, and increased his use of the whip to motivate productivity. But whipping black people doesn't make plants grow. By mid-July, Morrison faced the real possibility of total crop failure. Without a tobacco harvest, he couldn't pay his debts. Without income, he'd be forced to sell enslaved people to raise capital, breaking up black families who'd lived on this farm for generations. The entire operation faced collapse. James watched this unfolding crisis with careful attention. This young black man understood exactly what was happening to the tobacco and exactly how to fix it. But speaking up carried enormous risks. If he suggested a solution and it failed, he'd be blamed and punished. If he suggested a solution and it succeeded, he'd reveal capabilities that might threaten white authority. Either outcome could lead to James being sold away from his black family, transported south to the brutal sugar plantations where black people worked until their bodies gave out. Yet James also understood that doing nothing meant watching his black community suffer. If Morrison sold people to cover losses, James's own family might be separated. His mother Hannah might be sold. His younger sister Clara might be sold. The black people he'd lived among his entire life, his extended family and community, all faced potential destruction. The crisis reached its peak on a scorching July afternoon. Morrison gathered all his enslaved black workers in the main yard, this white man's face reflecting desperation and rage. Patterson stood beside him, this white overseer holding his whip, ready to enforce whatever commands came. "The crop is failing," Morrison announced to the assembled black people. "You've been lazy, incompetent, worthless. I should whip every one of you for allowing this to happen." James stood among the other black workers, watching this white man blame black people for weather and soil conditions beyond anyone's control. He saw his mother Hannah standing with the domestic workers, her dark face carefully neutral, but her eyes worried. He saw his father Samuel, this black man's powerful shoulders slumped with exhaustion from weeks of increased labor under Patterson's harsh demands. He saw Moses, the elderly black man who'd shared stories of Caesar the blacksmith, his weathered face reflecting resignation to whatever came next.
And in that moment, James Brooks made a decision that would change his life and create a legend. This young black man stepped forward from the assembled workers. This act of initiative itself dangerous for an enslaved black person. "Master Morrison," James said, his voice respectful but clear, "I believe I know what's wrong with the tobacco and how to save it." Silence fell across the yard like a physical weight. The other black workers stared at James in shock and fear. No one contradicted white people. No one volunteered opinions to white masters. Certainly no 17-year-old enslaved black boy challenged white authority by claiming superior knowledge about farming. Patterson moved towards James immediately, this white overseer's hand raising his whip. "You don't speak unless spoken to. You—" "Wait," Morrison interrupted, holding up a hand to stop Patterson. This white man studied James with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "You know what's wrong with the tobacco?" "Yes, sir," James replied, meeting Morrison's gaze directly. "Another dangerous act for an enslaved black person. The plants have black shank disease. It's caused by fungus in the soil, made worse by the wet spring followed by hot, dry summer. The disease spreads through root systems, which is why it started in the south field where we've grown tobacco longest and is spreading north." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "How do you know this?"
"I've been watching the plants, sir. The yellowing pattern, the way stems rot at the base, the progression from field to field. I've seen this disease described in farming journals that come to the house. My mother brings them to our cabin sometimes to use as fire kindling. I read them before we burn them." This admission carried its own danger. Black literacy was illegal in Virginia. Admitting James could read might bring punishment. But James was gambling that Morrison's desperation to save his crop would override concerns about an enslaved black man's education. "You can read?" Morrison asked, his white face reflecting complicated emotions, surprise, suspicion, but also desperate hope. "Yes, sir. My mother taught me when I was young, before the laws against it got stricter. I've been reading about farming methods, about plant diseases, about crop management for years." Patterson stepped forward again. "Master Morrison, you can't listen to a slave about farming. He's trying to make himself seem important. "I'll decide what I can and cannot listen to," Morrison snapped at his white overseer. He turned back to James. "You say you know what's wrong? Do you know how to fix it?" This was the moment. James could retreat into silence, claim he only understood the problem but not the solution. Or he could step fully into dangerous territory by asserting his knowledge completely. "Yes, sir," James said. "We need to stop the disease from spreading and save what plants we can. First, we remove all infected plants immediately and burn them so the fungus doesn't spread further. Second, we treat the soil in affected areas with lime to change the pH and kill the fungus. Third, we change our irrigation to stop overwatering the healthy plants, since wet soil encourages fungus growth. Fourth, we rotate in a cover crop of cowpeas in the worst affected areas to restore soil health for next season." Morrison listened to this young black man outline a comprehensive treatment plan with more sophistication than any white farmer in the county could have produced. "Where did you learn all this?" "From reading, sir. From watching. From listening to older black folks who farmed their whole lives and know things they never get credit for knowing. My father Samuel has forgotten more about tobacco than most people ever learn. But no one asks him because he's black. Moses has 60 years of farming experience, but no one consults him because he's enslaved. We black people see everything, sir. We work with these plants every day. We know them in ways white folks who just give orders can't know them." The yard remained silent. Every black person watching this unprecedented moment. An enslaved black teenager was lecturing a white master about farming, claiming superior knowledge, asserting black competence in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions of white supremacy. Morrison studied James for a long moment. Practical concerns warred with ideological resistance. Everything in his white Southern culture told him that black people were inferior, that enslaved people couldn't possess such knowledge, that accepting agricultural advice from a 17-year-old black boy was absurd. But his crop was dying, his economic survival was threatened, and this young black man had just demonstrated more sophisticated understanding of plant pathology than anyone else available. "Patterson," Morrison said finally, "gather the workers. We're going to try what James suggested." Patterson's white face flushed with anger and humiliation. His authority had just been publicly undermined by an enslaved black teenager. "Sir, you cannot be serious. You're going to let a slave tell us how to?" "I'm going to save my crop," Morrison interrupted coldly. "You've been overseer for 8 years, and this is the worst failure we've ever faced. Maybe it's time to try something different." He turned to James. "You'll supervise the implementation of this treatment plan. Patterson will provide whatever resources you need. If this works, we'll discuss your role going forward. If it fails—" He left the threat unspoken. What followed was the most extraordinary 2 weeks in the Morrison farm's history. James Brooks, this 17-year-old enslaved black man, effectively took over management of the tobacco crop recovery. He directed older black workers with respect, explaining his reasoning so they understood not just what to do, but why. He worked alongside them in the fields, this young black man's hands getting dirty while his mind orchestrated a complex agricultural rescue operation. First, they identified and removed all infected plants. James walked every row personally, his trained eye spotting disease that others might miss. Over 3 days, they pulled and burned nearly 40% of the tobacco crop. It looked like catastrophic loss, but James explained to the black workers that saving 60% was better than losing everything. "Plants are like people," James told Moses as they worked together pulling infected tobacco. "Sometimes you have to let the sick ones go to protect the healthy ones. It's not giving up, it's choosing survival." Next came soil treatment. James calculated lime quantities needed for different field areas based on observed infection severity. He organized application schedules that balanced thoroughness with efficiency. He taught younger black workers, like his friend Benjamin, how to recognize signs of fungal infection so they could spot problems early in future seasons. The irrigation changes required convincing Morrison to alter established practices. James explained how overwatering created conditions that encouraged black shank fungus. He demonstrated with small test areas how reducing water actually improved plant health. Slowly, Morrison began deferring to James's judgment on multiple aspects of crop management. Throughout this period, James maintained careful balance between competence and deference. He never forgot he was an enslaved black man working within a white supremacist system. He phrased suggestions as questions. "Master Morrison, would it be worth trying this approach?" He gave credit to others. Moses suggested we check those plants more carefully. He performed physical labor alongside strategic thinking, making sure white observers saw him as hard worker, not just theorist. But among the black community, James's status was transforming. Other black workers watched this young black man save the farm through pure intelligence and knowledge. They saw him command respect from white authority, not through submission, but through demonstrated excellence. They witnessed a black person forcing white people to acknowledge black brilliance. Hannah watched her son with complicated emotions. Pride in his achievements mixed with fear for his safety. She knew that exceptional black people drew dangerous attention. "Be careful, James," she whispered to him one evening. "You're changing things, and change scares white folks. They might accept your help now because they're desperate, but what happens when the desperation passes?" "I know, Mama," James replied, "but I couldn't watch our community suffer when I had knowledge that might help. Whatever happens next, at least I tried." By early August, the results were undeniable. The infection had stopped spreading. The remaining 60% of tobacco plants were recovering, showing healthy green growth. The treated soil showed no new fungal development. James's comprehensive plan was working. The Morrison farm would have a harvest, reduced from normal yields, but sufficient to meet financial obligations and avoid forced sales of enslaved black people. Morrison called another assembly in the main yard, gathering all the black workers again. But this time the atmosphere was different. This white man's face showed relief rather than anger. "The tobacco is recovering," Morrison announced. "We'll have a harvest. That's because of James." He looked at the young black man directly. "You saved this farm. You demonstrated knowledge that I didn't know any of you possessed." Patterson stood to the side, this white overseer's face reflecting resentment and humiliation. His authority had been permanently diminished. A black teenager had accomplished what he couldn't. "James, you'll continue managing the tobacco harvest. You'll work directly with me on planning next year's crop rotation. And," he paused, seeming to struggle with words, "you'll be given time to teach other workers what you know. We can't afford to waste this knowledge." This announcement rippled through the black community like thunder. A white master was officially recognizing a black man's intellectual authority. James Brooks, enslaved and legally property, was being elevated to a position of respect based purely on demonstrated excellence. But not everyone was pleased.
Patterson saw this as personal affront and threat to white supremacy itself. He began plotting ways to undermine James, looking for mistakes, waiting for opportunities to reassert white authority over this too successful black man. The harvest that year proved James's methods worked. The 60% of tobacco they'd saved produced excellent quality leaves. Morrison earned enough to pay his debts and have surplus. By objective measures, James Brooks's intervention had saved the farm from financial collapse. Word spread through the county about what had happened on the Morrison farm. Other white farmers heard about an enslaved black man who understood plant pathology, who'd saved a crop through scientific methods. Some were curious, asking Morrison about the techniques used. Others were hostile, viewing James as a dangerous example of black capability that threatened racial hierarchies. One white neighbor, a plantation owner named Charles Whitfield, visited Morrison specifically to voice concerns. "You're making a mistake elevating this boy," Whitfield told Morrison over whiskey on the front porch. "You give slaves too much authority. They start thinking they're equal. Next thing you know, you've got rebellion on your hands." "James saved my tobacco crop," Morrison replied. "He demonstrated knowledge that I couldn't afford to ignore." "That's exactly the problem," Whitfield insisted. "You've acknowledged that a black slave knows more than white men about farming. You've undermined the natural order. Other slaves will start expecting similar treatment. It's dangerous precedent." Morrison was silent, recognizing the truth in Whitfield's concerns from the perspective of white supremacy's internal logic. Allowing James' authority did challenge assumptions about black inferiority. It did create precedent that threatened social order built on white racial dominance. But Morrison was also a pragmatist. His farm was surviving because of James's knowledge. That practical reality competed with ideological purity. The tension came to a head that winter. Patterson, feeling his authority slipping, decided to reassert control through violence. He waited for an opportunity when Morrison was away in Richmond on business. James was working in the barn, organizing tools for spring planting, when Patterson approached with 3 white men from neighboring farms. These white men wanted to witness Patterson putting an uppity slave back in his place. "You've gotten too comfortable," Patterson said, his white face twisted with resentment. "You think you're special because Morrison listened to you once, but you're still just a slave, and I'm still the overseer. It's time you remembered your place." James straightened slowly, this young black man reading danger in Patterson's expression. "I'm just doing the work Master Morrison assigned me." "You're acting like you run this farm," Patterson snarled.
"You're giving orders to other slaves, making decisions, Carrying yourself like you're somebody important? That ends now." James saw the whip in Patterson's hand. He understood what was coming. This white overseer was going to beat him, to humiliate him in front of witnesses, to demonstrate that black intelligence didn't protect black bodies from white violence. "I've only done what Master Morrison authorized," James said carefully. "If you have concerns about my work, perhaps we should discuss them when Master Morrison returns." "I don't need Morrison's permission to discipline slaves on his farm," Patterson replied. "That's my job, and you need discipline." What happened next became part of the legend. As Patterson raised his whip, Samuel, James's father, stepped into the barn. This older black man had seen the white men heading toward where his son worked and had come to intervene. "Sir," Samuel said to Patterson, his voice respectful but firm, "James has done nothing wrong. He's been working as Master Morrison instructed. If you have concerns about my work, perhaps we should discuss them when Master Morrison returns." "I don't need Morrison's permission to discipline slaves on his farm," Patterson replied. "That's my job, and you need discipline." What happened next became part of the legend. As Patterson raised his whip, Samuel, James's father, stepped into the barn. This older black man had seen the white men heading toward where his son worked and had come to intervene. "Sir," Samuel said to Patterson, his voice respectful but firm, "James has done nothing wrong. He's been working as Master Morrison instructed. If you punish him for following Master's orders, Master Morrison will want to know why." Patterson's face flushed deeper red. Now another black man was challenging him. "Are you threatening me?" "No, sir," Samuel replied. "I'm just pointing out that Master Morrison specifically assigned James to manage the tobacco recovery. He told all of us that James was to continue that work through winter planning. If you interfere with that, Master Morrison will ask questions." Other black workers had begun gathering near the barn, drawn by tension in the air. Moses was there, Benjamin, Ruth, Clara, a dozen black people creating silent witness to what was unfolding. Their presence changed the dynamic. Patterson could beat one or two black people in private, but beating them in front of this many witnesses, especially when they'd done nothing wrong beyond being competent, would create problems even in Virginia's slave society. The white men Patterson had brought to witness James's humiliation were now uncomfortable witnesses to Patterson's frustrated rage. One of them, a farmer named Lucas, spoke up. "Maybe the boy's father is right, Patterson. If Morrison specifically put him in charge of tobacco management, beating him might cause more problems than it solves." Patterson stood trembling with fury, his whip raised but his authority undermined. He couldn't back down completely without losing face, but he also couldn't proceed without potential consequences. "This isn't over," Patterson finally said to James. "You watch yourself. One mistake, one moment of disrespect, and I'll make sure you remember what you are." He left with the other white men, but everyone understood the situation had changed. Patterson had been blocked not through rebellion, but through careful invocation of Morrison's authority and the presence of black witnesses who could testify to what had occurred. Samuel turned to his son after the white men departed.
"That was close." "Thank you, Papa," James said quietly. "You took a big risk." "You're my son," Samuel replied simply. "You think I'd let them hurt you without trying to stop it? Besides, you've given all of us hope. You've shown that black people can achieve respect through excellence. That's worth protecting." Moses approached them, this elderly black man's face thoughtful. "What happened today is important. Patterson tried to reassert white control through violence, and we stopped him by being smart, by understanding how to use the system's own rules against it. That's how we survive, how we resist. Not through open rebellion that gets us all killed, but through intelligence, through unity, through careful strategy.
Word of the barn confrontation spread through the county's black community via the invisible networks enslaved people maintained. James Brooks's name was carried on whispers. This young black man who'd saved a farm through brilliance and who'd faced down a white overseer through community support. When Morrison returned from Richmond and learned what had occurred, he called both Patterson and James to the main house. "I'm told there was an incident while I was away." Patterson began describing a version where James had been insubordinate and needed discipline. But Morrison cut him off. "James, what happened?" James recounted events accurately, neither exaggerating nor minimizing. He didn't paint Patterson as villain, merely described what occurred. Morrison listened, then made a decision that shocked everyone. "Patterson, you're no longer overseer. You're dismissed. Pack your things and leave my farm by tomorrow." Patterson's white face went pale. "Sir, you can't dismiss me over a slave's word." "I'm dismissing you because you tried to punish a worker for being competent," Morrison replied. "James saved this farm. He's more valuable to my operation than you are. I can't afford to lose his knowledge because you're threatened by his intelligence." This was extraordinary. A white man had just chosen to keep an enslaved black man over a white overseer. Word of this decision spread like wildfire through Virginia's plantations. Some white people saw Morrison as betrayer of white supremacy. Others saw him as pragmatic businessman, prioritizing results over ideology. For the black community, Morrison's decision meant something even more powerful. It meant that black excellence could be rewarded, that black intelligence could command respect even in slavery's brutal system, that white supremacy's logic could be challenged through demonstrated competence. James Brooks was 18 years old, and he'd become a legend. The following years saw James's influence on the Morrison farm continue to grow. He implemented crop rotation systems that improved soil health. He introduced new fertilization methods he'd read about in agricultural journals. He trained younger black workers, not just in physical labor, but in understanding the science behind farming practices. He transformed the Morrison farm from average operation into one of the most productive small farms in the county. But James never forgot what he was. Despite the respect Morrison showed him, despite the authority he exercised over farm operations, despite the legend growing around his name, James remained enslaved. He was still property. He could still be sold if Morrison faced financial pressures. He could still be punished if he stepped too far beyond the narrow boundaries white society permitted exceptional black people. His mother, Hannah, reminded him constantly of these realities. "You're walking a dangerous path, son. Every success makes you more valuable, but also more threatening to white folks who need to believe black people are inferior. Be proud of what you've accomplished, but never forget how fragile your position is." James understood. He'd created a space for himself through excellence, but that space existed within slavery's brutal confines. He was a respected enslaved man, which was still infinitely less than a free man. Yet James used his position to help other black people whenever possible. He made sure younger black workers learned not just how to follow orders, but why those orders made sense, educating them about farming science the way his parents had educated him. He negotiated with Morrison for better conditions for the black workers, arguing that healthy, rested workers were more productive. He created small advantages, tiny increases in autonomy and dignity that mattered to people living under systematic oppression. Benjamin, a young black man who worked closely with James, became his primary student. James taught Benjamin everything he knew about farming, about reading, about careful navigation of white power structures. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Benjamin asked one day. They were examining tobacco seedlings in early spring of 1845, planning that year's planting. "Because knowledge shouldn't die with one person," James replied. "If something happens to me, if I'm sold or if I die, this knowledge needs to survive. You'll teach it to others, and they'll teach it to others. That's how we black people preserve what's important. That's how we fight back against the ignorance white folks want to trap us in." "Do you think we'll ever be free?" Benjamin asked quietly. James was silent for a moment, considering how to answer honestly without destroying hope. "I think freedom is coming, but probably not in our lifetimes. The contradictions in this system are too great to sustain forever. Northern states are abolishing slavery. Abolitionist movements are growing. Economic forces are changing. Something will break eventually. When it does, we need to be ready. We need to have educated ourselves, maintained our dignity, preserved our families and communities, so that when freedom comes, we're prepared to make the most of it." This long-term perspective, this understanding that resistance wasn't just about immediate escape, but about preparing future generations for freedom, characterized James's approach to life. He was building something larger than himself, creating a legacy that would outlast slavery. In 1846, a significant event tested James's principles and influence. A young black woman named Ruth was brought to the Morrison farm, purchased at auction to replace an elderly domestic worker who died. Ruth was 19, intelligent, strong, and terrified. She'd been sold away from her family in North Carolina, transported to Virginia, separated from everyone she knew. James first saw Ruth working in the main house, this young black woman's eyes reflecting pain and fear. He felt immediate connection, not just attraction, though she was beautiful, but recognition of shared spirit. He saw intelligence in her careful movements, resilience in how she adapted to new circumstances, strength in how she maintained dignity despite trauma. He approached her one Sunday afternoon when the black workers had brief free time. "I'm James. I wanted to welcome you to the Morrison farm." Ruth looked at him cautiously, this young black woman assessing whether this was genuine kindness or whether he wanted something from her. "I've heard about you. People say you're special, that you practically run this farm despite being enslaved." "People exaggerate," James replied with a slight smile. "I just try to use what knowledge I have to make things better for our community. How are you adjusting?" "As well as can be expected when you've been torn from your family and sold to strangers," Ruth said, her voice carrying edge of justified anger. "I suppose I should be grateful Master Morrison doesn't seem as cruel as some, but grateful isn't what I'm feeling right now." James nodded, appreciating her honesty. "You don't have to perform gratitude with me. I understand. We all understand. Being sold away from family is one of slavery's worst cruelties." They talked for an hour that afternoon, Ruth slowly relaxing as she realized James wasn't going to judge her anger or expect false cheerfulness. Over following weeks, they continued talking whenever possible. James shared his knowledge, his perspectives, his hopes for the future. Ruth shared stories about her family, her mother who'd taught her to sew, her father who'd been sold south when she was 12, her younger brothers she'd probably never see again. Their relationship deepened into love, this young black man and this young black woman finding comfort and strength in each other. In the summer of 1847, they asked Morrison's permission to marry. This was standard practice, enslaved people seeking white approval for relationships because even marriage existed under white authority. Morrison agreed, and James and Ruth were married in a ceremony that blended Christian traditions with African-derived customs the black community preserved. They jumped the broom, this symbolic act that predated American slavery, that connected them to ancestors and affirmed their union even though it had no legal status in white law. Their marriage created foundation for James's next phase of life. With Ruth beside him, with the respect he'd earned on the Morrison farm, with the knowledge he'd accumulated and taught others, James Brooks was building a life of meaning within slavery's constraints. It wasn't freedom, but it was resistance through existence, through love, through family, through excellence, through refusing to let slavery destroy everything valuable. In 1848, their daughter was born. They named her Hannah after James's mother, this tiny black baby girl who represented hope and future. James held his daughter and felt overwhelming love mixed with fierce determination. This child would grow up enslaved unless something changed. This child deserved freedom, deserved education, deserved opportunities to develop her full potential. James redoubled his efforts to create better conditions, to preserve knowledge, to prepare for a future he believed would eventually come. The 1850s brought significant changes to Virginia and the nation. Tensions over slavery intensified. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required northern states to return escaped enslaved people to southern owners, inflaming abolitionist sentiment. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 renewed violent conflicts over slavery's expansion. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 terrified Southern white people with the specter of armed black insurrection. On the Morrison farm, James watched these developments with careful attention. He understood the nation was moving toward crisis, towards some kind of resolution of the fundamental contradiction between American ideals of liberty and American practice of slavery. He didn't know what form that resolution would take, but he prepared himself and his black community for change. Robert Morrison grew older, his health declining. His son Thomas, a man in his 30s, would eventually inherit the farm. Thomas had grown up watching James manage agricultural operations, had learned to respect this black man's knowledge even while maintaining white supremacist assumptions about racial hierarchy. The relationship was complicated, built on professional respect that coexisted with systematic dehumanization. By 1860, James Brooks was 35 years old, father of 3 children, husband to Ruth, respected leader of the Morrison Farms black community. He'd transformed from enslaved child to legendary figure, not through escape or rebellion, but through excellence, intelligence, dignity, and strategic navigation of slavery's brutal system. But the legend of James Brooks extended beyond the Morrison farm.
Throughout Virginia's black community, his name carried weight. Enslaved black people knew about the man who'd saved a white farm through brilliance, who'd earned respect through competence, who demonstrated that black intelligence could force white acknowledgement even within slavery's confines. He'd become a symbol of black capability, proof that white supremacy's claims about black inferiority were lies. When the Civil War erupted in April 1861, James understood this was the crisis he'd been anticipating. The nation's contradictions about slavery were being resolved through violence. He didn't know how the war would end, but he knew it would change everything. Virginia seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. The Morrison farm, like most Southern farms, felt immediate impacts. Thomas Morrison, who'd inherited the farm after his father's death, joined the Confederate Army. White men from neighboring farms enlisted, believing they were defending their homeland and their right to enslave black people. This left farms short of white supervision. On the Morrison farm, James effectively ran operations with minimal oversight. An elderly white manager named Foster nominally supervised, but Foster understood nothing about farming and deferred entirely to James's judgment. For the first time in his life, James managed the farm almost as a free man would. He made decisions about planting, harvesting, resource allocation. He organized the black workers according to efficient principles rather than Patterson's old brutal methods. He negotiated with white merchants for supplies, conducted business in town, operated with a degree of autonomy that would have been unthinkable before the war. But this autonomy existed in precarious circumstances. Confederate authorities remained suspicious of unsupervised black people. Patrols checked farms to prevent escape attempts or insurrection. Laws against black literacy were enforced even more strictly as white Southerners feared educated black people aiding Union forces. James walked this dangerous line carefully. He kept the Morrison farm productive, which served Confederate interests and prevented authorities from investigating more closely. He maintained order among the black workers, demonstrating that they could function independently without violence or rebellion that would trigger white reprisals. But secretly, he was also preparing for freedom. He taught every black person on the Morrison farm to read and write, holding secret lessons after dark in the cabins.
When this war ends, we'll need these skills, James told his students. We'll need to read contracts, understand laws, manage our own affairs. Education will be our first tool of freedom. He also maintained careful accounting of the farm's productivity, documenting yields, profits, resource management. This farm has been profitable for decades because of our labor, James explained to Moses and the other black workers.
When freedom comes, we'll need evidence of our contributions. We'll need to prove our worth so white people can't continue denying us compensation for all we've built. News from the war reached the Morrison farm through various channels. White people talked carelessly around black domestic workers, assuming enslaved people didn't understand or wouldn't act on information. Black people traveling between farms shared news, creating invisible intelligence network. Occasionally, Union soldiers approached farms, and black people risked everything to provide them assistance. In June of 1863, word reached the farm about the Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln had declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, effective January 1, 1863. Technically, this meant everyone on the Morrison farm was legally free, though Confederate authorities rejected federal authority and continued enforcing slavery. James gathered the black community in the barn one night to discuss the proclamation. "This doesn't mean immediate freedom for us," he explained. "Virginia is still controlled by the Confederacy, and they don't recognize Lincoln's authority. But it means the Union is officially fighting to end slavery. It means if Union forces reach us, we'll be protected as free people." "Should we try to escape?" Benjamin asked. He was 28 now, married with 2 children, a capable farmer whom James had mentored for years. "That's each person's choice," James replied. "Escaping carries enormous risks. Confederate patrols shoot runaways. If you're caught, you'll be sold south or killed. But staying here also carries risks. We don't know how this war will end or what will happen to us if the Confederacy wins." "What are you going to do?" Ruth asked her husband. James considered carefully before answering. "I'm going to stay and keep this farm running, not for the Morrisons or the Confederacy, but for us. This farm represents our labor, our knowledge, our community. When freedom comes, I want us positioned to benefit from what we've built. If we all escape, the farm collapses and we lose any claim to compensation or land. But if we maintain it, demonstrate we can manage it ourselves, we might have a foundation for a new life." This pragmatic approach characterized James's strategy throughout the war. He wasn't passive or accepting of slavery. He was strategically positioning his black community for the best possible outcome when freedom arrived. The war's final years brought increasing hardship. Union blockades limited supplies. Confederate currency became worthless. Food grew scarce as armies requisitioned crops. The Morrison farm struggled to maintain productivity with limited resources. James demonstrated leadership through these crises. He organized the black workers to grow food for their own survival beyond what Confederate authorities could confiscate. He taught preservation techniques to stretch limited supplies through winter.
He negotiated with Foster, the white manager, for better rations for black workers, arguing that starving people couldn't maintain productivity. In April of 1865, news reached the farm that Richmond had fallen. The Confederate capital had been captured by Union forces. Within days, word came that Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The Union had won. James Brooks stood in the tobacco field where he'd worked since childhood, this 40-year-old black man who'd been enslaved his entire life, and realized with overwhelming emotion that he was about to become free. Everything he'd worked toward, every lesson taught, every careful strategy, every moment of maintaining dignity through oppression, all of it had been preparation for this moment. He gathered the black community that evening. 43 black people, ranging from elderly Moses, now in his 80s, to James's youngest child, a 5-year-old son named Samuel, after his grandfather. "The war is over," James told them, his voice thick with emotion. "Slavery is ending. We're going to be free." The words hung in the air, too enormous to fully comprehend. Free. After generations of bondage, after centuries of systematic oppression, after lifetimes defined by slavery's brutal confines, freedom was arriving. "What happens now?" asked Clara, James's younger sister, a woman in her 30s with 6 children of her own. "Now we decide who we want to be," James replied. "We're no longer property. We're citizens. We'll need to figure out how to live as free people, how to support ourselves, how to protect our rights. It won't be easy. White people won't suddenly accept us as equals just because a war ended. But we'll have opportunities our parents never had, opportunities our children will be able to build on." The transition from slavery to freedom was neither immediate nor simple. Virginia, like other Confederate states, had to be reconstructed and reintegrated into the Union. The process involved military occupation, political restructuring, and difficult negotiations over black people's rights and status. On the Morrison farm, the initial confusion was palpable. Thomas Morrison returned from the war defeated, wounded, bitter about Confederate loss. He found his farm managed entirely by the black people he'd considered property, his white authority dissolved. James approached him carefully, understanding this white man's psychological devastation, but also recognizing opportunity. "Mr. Morrison, the farm has remained productive through the war. The tobacco crop is ready for harvest. We've maintained buildings, equipment, livestock. Everything your family built still exists." Morrison looked at James with complicated emotions, gratitude mixed with resentment, respect fighting with ideology. "You kept it running." "We kept it running," James corrected gently. "All of us. The black people who've lived and worked here for generations. We protected this place because it's our home, too."
"You're free now," Morrison said bitterly. "You'll all leave. The farm will collapse." "We don't want to leave," James replied, speaking truth that surprised Morrison. "This is our home. We've built this place with our labor. We want to stay and continue working it, but not as enslaved people, as free laborers who are fairly compensated, who have rights to what we produce, who are partners rather than property." This proposal, radical for its time, became the foundation for Reconstruction-era labor arrangements across the South. Formerly enslaved black people negotiating with former white owners for sharecropping or tenant farming arrangements that provided some autonomy and compensation while maintaining continuity. James negotiated terms for the Morrison Farms black community. They would work the land and receive half the crop yield. They would have authority over their own labor, managing work schedules and methods. They would educate their children without restriction. They would have legal rights as free people, including ability to leave if better opportunities arose. These negotiations weren't entirely fair, reflecting power imbalances that persisted after slavery's legal end. But they represented enormous improvement over bondage, and they established James Brooks as a leader in Virginia's Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress to assist formerly enslaved people's transition to freedom, recognized James as valuable community leader. Bureau representatives consulted him about labor arrangements, education needs, legal protections. James became intermediary between Virginia's black population and government authorities trying to manage Reconstruction. He also continued his lifelong commitment to black education. With slavery's laws against black literacy abolished, James established a school in the old tobacco barn where he'd secretly taught during the war. He recruited teachers from among literate black people in the community. He organized fundraising to purchase books and supplies. He ensured every black child on and around the Morrison farm received education. His own children were among the first students. Hannah, his eldest daughter, now 17, Samuel Jr., age 10, and young Clara, age 7, all attended regularly.
James felt profound satisfaction watching his children learn openly, legally, without fear of punishment that had shadowed his own stolen education. "What you're teaching them goes beyond reading and arithmetic," Ruth observed to her husband. They sat on their cabin's small porch one evening, watching the sunset over tobacco fields that looked the same as always, but held entirely different meaning and freedom. "I'm teaching them they have worth," James replied, "that their minds matter, that their ideas have value, that they can contribute to building something new. For so long, white supremacy told black people we were inferior, only suited for labor under white supervision. Education proves that lie. Every black child who learns to read, who understands mathematics, who thinks critically, demonstrates our full humanity." The years following the Civil War were tumultuous for the South and the nation. Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship to formerly enslaved people, and protecting black men's voting rights. Black men voted for the first time, electing black representatives to state legislatures and Congress. Black schools and churches flourished. Black businesses emerged. For a brief period called Radical Reconstruction, it seemed America might actually provide equality for black people. James Brooks participated actively in this political transformation. He attended meetings organizing Virginia's black voters. He helped draft petitions advocating for black rights. He testified before Freedmen's Bureau officials about labor conditions and needed protections. He became a respected voice in Virginia's black political community. But white Southern resistance to black freedom grew increasingly violent. The Ku Klux Klan and similar terrorist organizations emerged, using intimidation and murder to suppress black political participation. White Southern Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, worked to restore white supremacy through legal and extra-legal means. In 1866, James received threats warning him to stop political organizing. A cross was burned near the Morrison farm. Black families in neighboring counties reported nighttime visits from armed white men. The violence was designed to terrify black people back into submission. James called a community meeting to address the threats. "They want us to be afraid," he told the assembled black people. "They want us to retreat, to accept second-class status, to surrender the rights we've gained. We can't let fear win. We didn't survive slavery just to accept a slightly less brutal form of oppression." "But they're killing people," Benjamin said, his voice reflecting real fear. "Black men who speak up are being murdered. You're taking enormous risks." "I know," James acknowledged, "and I understand if you want to step back, want to protect your families by staying quiet. No one should judge those choices. But I have to keep pushing. My children need to grow up in a world where black people have full rights. That won't happen if we surrender now." Moses, now in his 80s and near the end of his life, spoke up in his wavering voice. "James, I've watched you your whole life, watched you grow from curious child to legendary man. You've always been different, always been special. But you're also right. We can't surrender. We've come too far. If old men like me can't see full equality in our lifetimes, at least we can keep fighting so children like your daughter Hannah will see it in theirs." This commitment to generational struggle, to fighting for a future that current generations might not live to see, sustained black resistance through Reconstruction and beyond. In 1867, Virginia held elections under new rules requiring black male suffrage. James helped organize black voters across his county, educating people about candidates and issues, protecting voters from intimidation, ensuring black voices were heard. The experience was extraordinary. Black men who'd been enslaved just 2 years earlier were now voting, participating in democracy, exercising citizenship rights that slavery had denied. James watched his friend Benjamin cast a ballot, this black man who'd been property selecting representatives to govern Virginia. The symbolism was overwhelming. But white resistance intensified. By 1870, white Southern Democrats had regained control of many state governments through violence, fraud, and voter suppression. The brief promise of Reconstruction was being reversed. The federal government, tired of ongoing conflict and influenced by Northern racism, gradually withdrew support for black rights in the South. By 1877, with the compromise that ended Reconstruction, black people in the South faced systematic disenfranchisement, segregation, and violence that would persist for another century. The Jim Crow era was beginning, creating new forms of racial oppression, only slightly less brutal than slavery. James Brooks was 52 years old in 1877, a black man who'd been born enslaved, who'd lived through slavery's end and Reconstruction's promise and disappointment. He'd seen freedom arrive and watched it be stolen back through different means. But James didn't surrender to despair. He continued teaching, continued organizing, continued building black community institutions. He understood that freedom was a long struggle, that progress wasn't linear, that setbacks didn't mean defeat. "We're planting seeds again," he told his students in the school he'd founded, "seeds that might take generations to grow. You might not see full equality in your lifetimes, but your children might. Your grandchildren certainly will. Everything we do now, every lesson learned, every right defended, every moment of dignity maintained, adds to a tide that will eventually overwhelm oppression. That's what I've learned in 52 years. Excellence matters. Education matters. Resistance matters. Never let them convince you that black people are inferior. Never surrender your worth. Never stop fighting." His daughter Hannah, now married with children of her own, taught alongside her father. His son Samuel was studying to become a minister, preparing to lead a black church that was often the center of black community life and resistance. His youngest daughter Clara was training as a seamstress, learning a trade that would provide economic independence. James's grandchildren attended the school he'd founded, these black children learning to read and calculate and think critically, carrying forward the legacy their grandfather had built through intelligence and determination. James Brooks died in 1895 at age 70, having lived through slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, and the beginning of Jim Crow. He died surrounded by family, by community he'd helped educate and organize, by people whose lives he'd transformed through teaching and leadership. His funeral was attended by hundreds of black people from across Virginia, people who'd been taught by James, or whose parents had been taught by James, or who simply knew the legend of the black man who'd saved a white farm through brilliance and who dedicated his freedom to building black community. Moses had died decades earlier, but his great-grandson spoke at James's funeral, describing the long line of black resistance that James embodied. Benjamin, now elderly himself, shared stories about learning farming science from James, about the quiet ways James had taught black people to value themselves in a world that devalued them. Ruth, James's wife of 48 years, spoke simply. "He was the smartest man I ever knew, and he used that intelligence to help others. That's what made him great. Not just his mind, but his heart." They buried James Brooks in the black cemetery near the Morrison farm, under an oak tree that had witnessed his entire life. The gravestone read, "James Brooks, 1825 to 1895. Teacher, leader, legend. He demonstrated that black excellence cannot be denied." But James Brooks's real legacy wasn't carved in stone. It lived in the black people he'd educated, in the institutions he'd built, in the example he'd set. It lived in the understanding that excellence was resistance, that education was liberation, that dignity was defiance. The school James founded continued operating for decades, becoming one of Virginia's first black schools to offer high school education. 3 of his grandchildren became teachers, spreading his commitment to black education. 2 great-grandchildren attended college in the early 1900s, extraordinary achievement for black people in Jim Crow South. His great-great-grandchildren participated in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, continuing the struggle James had begun. One of his descendants, a great-great-great-granddaughter named Angela Brooks, was arrested during the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, carrying on the family tradition of resistance through demonstration of black humanity and rights. When people asked Angela why she risked arrest, why she challenged segregation knowing the violence it might bring, she told them about her ancestor James Brooks. He taught me through generations that black people have always fought for freedom, always demonstrated our excellence despite oppression, always planted seeds for futures we might not live to see. I'm just continuing his work. The story of James Brooks reminds us that resistance takes many forms. He didn't escape slavery through the Underground Railroad, though that was heroic. He didn't lead armed rebellion, though that was courageous. He resisted through excellence, through education, through demonstrating black humanity so undeniably that even white supremacy had to acknowledge it. His story reminds us that one person can make a difference, that individual brilliance matters, but that individual achievement is most meaningful when directed toward collective liberation. James used his exceptional abilities not just for personal advancement, but to lift his entire community, to educate children, to prepare black people for freedom, to build institutions that would outlast him. His story reminds us that black people were never passive victims of oppression. They were active agents of their own liberation, using intelligence, creativity, courage, and strategic thinking to resist slavery's dehumanization and build foundations for eventual freedom. James Brooks was born enslaved on a small Virginia farm. He died a legend, a man whose name carried weight across Virginia's black community, whose influence extended through generations, whose example inspired resistance for a century after his death. He saved a white man's tobacco crop through scientific knowledge, and became a legend not because saving that crop mattered in itself, but because it demonstrated irrefutably that black intelligence existed, that black people could master complex knowledge, that white supremacy's fundamental premise was a lie. That demonstration mattered. It inspired other black people to pursue education, to value their own intelligence, to believe in their capability. It forced some white people to question racist assumptions, to recognize black humanity even if they couldn't fully embrace equality. It planted seeds that grew into movements for civil rights, for educational equality, for social justice. James Brooks understood something profound, that the struggle for black freedom was generational, that progress might be slow, that setbacks were inevitable, but that persistence eventually prevails. He taught his children and grandchildren to be excellent, to be educated, to be dignified, to never surrender their humanity regardless of what oppression they faced. That lesson echoes across generations. Every black person who pursues education, who demonstrates excellence, who refuses to be limited by others' prejudice, continues James Brooks's legacy. Every black teacher educating black children continues his work. Every black professional achieving in fields white supremacy tried to exclude them from proves his point. His story is specifically about one black man in one time and place, but it's also universal. It's about the power of intelligence over ignorance, excellence over oppression, dignity over dehumanization. It's about refusing to be what others say you are, insisting on your own worth, demonstrating your capability against all opposition. James Brooks was born in chains. He died free, surrounded by family and community he'd helped build, leaving a legacy that transcends his lifetime. He became a legend not through impossible feats or supernatural abilities, but through real human qualities: intelligence, persistence, courage, vision, and commitment to collective liberation. That's what makes his story powerful. He was extraordinary, but he was also human. His gifts were unusual, but not impossible. His circumstances were brutal, but he found ways to resist. His achievements were remarkable, but they built on knowledge and strategies developed by generations of Black people before him. James Brooks stands in a long line of Black resistance, Black excellence, Black humanity asserting itself against systematic efforts to deny it. He honored those who came before by using their knowledge. He honored those who would come after by teaching them and preparing them for freedom. This is the legacy of James Brooks, that one Black person armed with knowledge, committed to community, dedicated to liberation, can change countless lives. That excellence is resistance, that education is freedom, that dignity is defiance, that Black humanity cannot be denied, no matter how brutal the oppression. Remember James Brooks. Remember the Black man who saved a farm through brilliance, who became a legend through intelligence, who dedicated his freedom to educating and organizing Black people, who understood that liberation was generational struggle, requiring persistence across lifetimes. Remember that his story is not unique. Across the South, across slavery's long history, Black people resisted through excellence, through education, through maintenance of dignity, through countless acts of courage, large and small. Most of their names are lost to history, but their resistance mattered. They built foundations for freedom. They preserved humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. They passed forward knowledge and strength that sustained their children and grandchildren through ongoing oppression toward eventual liberation. James Brooks represents all of them, the known and unknown Black people who fought for freedom through excellence, who demonstrated Black humanity through intelligence, who planted seeds they knew they might not live to see grow, but planted them anyway, because future generations deserved better. His legacy lives in every Black person who pursues education, who values themselves despite others' prejudice, who works toward collective liberation, who understands that freedom is a long struggle, requiring commitment across generations. If this story inspired you, if James Brooks's courage and intelligence moved you, if you understand now how Black people fought for freedom through excellence, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover forgotten stories of Black resistance, Black brilliance, Black heroism every week. These are the histories that deserve to be remembered, the lives that changed the world, the ancestors whose struggles made our present possible. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about real courage, real intelligence, real Black excellence. Leave a comment telling us what James Brooks's story means to you and how it challenges you to think about resistance, education, and the long struggle for freedom. These stories matter. These Black lives matter. This history matters. Remember James Brooks. Remember that he became a legend by being excellent, by being educated, by being human in circumstances that tried to deny his humanity. Remember that his fight continues in every person who pursues excellence against opposition, who values education as liberation, who understands that dignity is resistance. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video where we uncover another chapter of Black history that deserves to be celebrated and remembered.